program that would help people be architects, but be architects inside the film industry or the video game industry or within politics or within, a curatorial practice or within the art world.
Sometimes we make architecture projects that are not meant to be buildings.
Without even knowing any of that history, there's been a real embrace of that kind of physical model making again. And it's their own reaction to what's tangible and what's virtual.
Welcome back to Mixed Signals, everybody. We're very happy to be here. Nihar doesn't like my intro. He says I don't bring enough energy. So I'll work on that, Nihar, in the future. But we're very happy to have some exciting guests today. Let me first tell you who's in the room. As always, I'm your co-host, Caleb White. My other co-host,
Christiana Bennett.
My third co-host,
Waleed Sewell,
who's not third, by the way.
I'm third.
He was third this time. But we're also really happy to have Matt Lopez with us, a returning friend of the pod. Matt Lopez is a SCI-Arc alum, so I think he'll have some interesting things to talk about today. And our two guests, which we'll dive into a lot more about these two, but we're very happy to have Nate Hume and Liam Young. We've been watching the stuff that SCI-Arc does, obviously, for years, but we're really happy to have you guys come on and talk about your programs, talk about your personal work, and just, hang out.
Thank you for having us.
Do you maybe you need to tell the audience why it looks like there's a volcano explosion happening behind you?
So we're coming to you from an exhibition here in SCI-Arc Gallery called Planetary Imaginaries, which is an exhibition of mine. It's a collection of 4 imaginary worlds, and behind us is SCI-Arc's new virtual production screen and LED wall, where 4 of my films are just going to be on rotation as we're talking. So it's probably the worst possible setup for a filming and podcast, and the people in the room are losing their minds trying to adjust lighting in real time to the changing nature of the screen. But as we go, you'll see glimpses from 4 different films, 4 different imaginary worlds. Awesome. The one behind us right now is called World Machine, which is a visualization of the future infrastructures of AI. But we'll maybe as some images come up, we might refer to some things in the background as we go. But yeah, this is Planetary Imaginaries.
No, thank you. I mean, Liam, I should tell you, I've mentioned this before on the podcast. I'm a big fan of the work, so it's actually just really cool to get to chat with you. And seeing your work in the background is, that's a bonus.
I'm ready to jump in.
You want to jump in? Should we just get going?
I mean, I guess I could say, clearly we invited you because as a group, as SCI-Arc as a group, and Liam Young specifically, I have like a love for fantasy worlds, and sometimes I'm like, I'm done with architecture. I am not interested anymore. And so maybe I need to go and escape to SCI-Arc and join one of your programs, because I think a lot of people feel the same way. And I was reading something in the A+U journal or magazine that for post-digital issue, where there was an interview with you where we kind of discussed that there's so many people that study architecture that find themselves not necessarily feeling like they have to enter the practice side of things. And, I think SCI-Arc offers a lot of the other sides of things that architects are interested in. So I'm happy to kind of dive into that. That's
actually a really good transition to the cold crits, guys, because the cold crits today is a little bit specifically designed towards that conversation. For the guys joining us, Liam and Nate, maybe you know what this is, maybe you don't. Cold crits is a segment we came up with to just basically, honestly, we were trying to get our students and other students to look at work from other institutions, to just honestly be aware of what other schools are working on, what other critics are working on. So I would say these maybe aren't crits per se, but what we like to do is look at some student work and try to connect the dots, add some context if we have it, or even just honestly react to some images, some models, some videos. So today, it's kind of an interesting setup. I went a little bit different direction. Normally we try to pick an institution and pick 2 maybe different projects or similar projects from that institution to compare, but I'm doing something a little bit different today. I wanted to have a little bit of fun with this because I knew we would be talking about this idea of interests in school that you might develop, and then maybe also like sometimes developing interests that might seem tangential to architecture. The first project, the top project there, that's a project from Lund University in Malmo, or I believe in Sweden. I don't know if it's actually in Malmo, but the project I thought was really, really compelling was it's a thesis project. It's a series of typologies This is kind of maybe, I just thought it had such an interesting relationship to a lot of student work we see right now, which leans heavily on the model and really is an honest kind of depiction of maybe an assembly and an aesthetic that comes out of that honesty. Beautiful work. I'll let you guys come back to this one. I just want to talk about the second one really quick, and then we'll circle back. So the second one is a project from the AA. And this is actually obviously much more in Liam's territory. It's cinematic. It's a project that is actually explained through a film. I'm showing us some screenshots from the film on the board here. There's also a brief description, which we can dig into that. We kind of tend to come back to descriptions after a little while looking at the images. And then I also have a link to the video. But I think the reason I wanted to pick these two is that I thought the conversation might go in this direction today a little bit about what we consider maybe disciplinary, what we consider different modes of representation to talk about the discipline. But yeah, maybe I'll just open up for the group if anybody wants to jump in and start unpacking.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, the way we typically deal with this isn't necessarily critiquing the work, but the general ideas and methods that fit in a larger discourse. And for me, and I'm maybe not speaking for Caleb here or anyone else, but for me, this goes back to the question of, sometimes we make architecture projects that are not meant to be buildings. The film, that becomes a narrative that's for the general public that revolves around, a storyline that has buildings, has space making, but isn't necessarily about the buildings being the main character. I come back to this idea of buildings not being the main character. And so both of these present themselves as products, two different ways of doing it, and it's for the masses. And to me, I know maybe the first project, the models, is a representation of space, but I actually read it totally different. I read it as a product that someone can actually buy and reproduce over and over and over again. So because of that, I actually really appreciate what I'm seeing here. And I think that kind of promotes the idea that an architect doesn't feel confined to necessarily need to make a building. And also, that's not a bad thing. I'm just saying these projects I think we picked on purpose because they start to echo ideas that aren't constrained to the discipline the way we understand it. Certainly isn't constrained to the ideas of Peter Eisenman, per se. That's not the realms that these things fit in. And so, yeah, that's how I see it, and that's how I appreciate it.
I mean, I think the first project brings up a number of questions of things that have been going on, certainly kind of within the academy. I mean, one is the return of models. So if there was there was a period probably 20, 25 years ago when, a lot of the new tools came into the schools. And so digital fabrication was big. You looked at a lot of, rapid prototyping, things at different scales. Then there was a little bit of evacuation of models. So the reliance on rendering, and then all the kind of hopes of what I think video or even, kind of VR would be. And the same was true. I could speak more to New York, but the offices that used to have huge model shops, which you can imagine when rent was high for businesses, the idea to invest in that and have that in-house, from small offices to large offices. And so during that period, probably 15, 20 years ago, you started to see that disappear, and you saw a few model shops open up that were independent, and people would outsource that when they needed it. I think, in the last probably decade, you saw a huge pushback from clients that were not so into the renderings or the video work and actually really wanted those models, or also it was just the moment that closed the project was back to the models. And so there's been a funny reverse where a bunch of those offices that had given that space over to conference rooms or this and that have brought the equipment back in, and the kind of model shops have returned. And then likewise, I think from younger students, without even knowing any of that history, there's been a real embrace of that kind of physical model making again. And I mean, I have certain suspicions of where that's coming from, and it's their own reaction to what's tangible and what's virtual. But I think it's also in seeing these models, which are a bit different than what you would see in an office. They're much closer to a diorama. I think you've also seen a lot of that in the last decade.
Right.
Students at schools, obsessively making each little book or the little kitty cat. So again, the high model making skills of the late 80s, early 90s, before we started having any, digital tools to make them or an option not to make them, would have never included that kind of, those figures. In some ways, it goes back to the really early photography and Saarinen, where they would make the figures and they would put them sticking out from the model and really think about setting the scene. It was much more like photography and filmmaking, but with those models. Totally. And so in some ways, I think, these students may or may not know kind of all that history, but on its own, it's kind of found its way back to that, which I find, interesting and also kind of curious. I don't think anyone would have gambled 15 years ago that we would have more models and funny little figures floating around schools. That was a period, like I remember, a number of you come out of Penn. I remember going to reviews there 15 years ago before I was teaching. There was 0 models. Now they're quite well known for their models, but everything was projected. There was nothing on the wall. It was all projected. Like no drawings, no models, because they had gone to hyperspace. Right. And so it's funny, I know even in the kind of time when you guys were there, how much that started to shift. So it's interesting, I think, seeing these two also in, at the same time, I think the video work has gotten so much more sophisticated, like the work that Liam's doing, and I'll let him jump in, is, way ahead of where it was 15, 20 years ago when they were trying to kind of replace models with that. So it's also a moment to rethink now, what could it be as you start to let clients and the audience back in with this technology that's in a whole different place than round one?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny when you folks proposed doing these cold crits, I was pretty resistant. I think the crit is a desperately broken format in the context of architecture and architecture schools. I don't do reviews or crits or juries, whatever we call them, in my program. I think they're a legacy of a dead pedagogy. I'm happy to entertain the conversation right now because I think like some of the projects you've chosen are good exemplars of why I think crits just don't work, in that I'm often talking to my students about the audience for their work. For the most part, when architecture students are making something, the audience for the work is a crit. It's a jury. It's a panel of people that someone's going to assemble to get there and talk about the work and judge it and assess it, or to use it in a worst case scenario as a form through which to just have a conversation with each other, because the jury turns up and they haven't seen each other in a while. They just want to, like, the student becomes wallpaper for their conversation. And models like that we're seeing, they're not disciplinary models in the sense that someone's making a model for a client presentation to explain a scheme. They're models that operate purely within the context of how a crit works. And they're really beautiful things. They're beautifully made, they communicate really well, but they're models for a crit. They're models whose site is not, a landscape in Lund or a vacant lot somewhere in Sweden. The site in which these models are built for is an architecture jury,
Can I ask a question, Liam? Because
although client meetings can be far more intense than a crit, and are very much that.
Right.
You're there with a model
Right.
and drawings on the wall or on a set, and that is what you're going to do for your entire career.
Well, I guess that's what
You are
schools train you to do,
practicing.
right?
Yeah.
It's like schools train you to be the architect professional that's in front of clients. I mean, movies have clients too, in a way. So,
I would love that to be the case. I don't think a jury trains an architecture student for a client meeting in any way, shape, or form. It might train them to argue or defend themselves, but not in the way that you need to be arguing for your work or ideas in a client meeting.
Here at SCI-Arc, we do a lot of them are table crits. So a lot of them are in Keck Hall, and it's almost everything the students have made up to that point, and it's everyone sitting, which is also makes a more equal. Loses the hierarchy of a student standing up there exhausted and the firing line standing against them. But it is much more of, I think, a conversation around the work versus, yes, the old school model, which was the firing line, and it was meant to find the one thing you had kind of not done well. So I think that model's been around for, half a century, and it's just now starting to kind of crack a little bit.
Well,
for good reason.
Maybe I could ask a question there, Liam, because actually I really like the way that you're talking about your program as being outward facing to a degree, because you're saying you're very focused on audience with a student. And I think that's so great, because you're right that it doesn't help us to teach towards the jury, right? And they should be thinking about things that are implications beyond that room.
Well, we didn't spend much time talking about the
video, right?
Bartlett. Yeah.
I did have a question about this, because Nate, you mentioned very beautifully that the capacity to generate kind of spectacular video has just increased to such a level. Like Liam, you were producing stuff that was kind of unbelievable long before I would say the capacity kind of caught up to a degree, which is, incredible. But now we get student projects where the cinematography is so rich and immersive that I just wondered about your thoughts on how maybe it opens that to a larger group of people that can use that, and namely students, right? Architecture students.
Well, not just architecture students, even I see it in the middle school and high school with my kids, what they're able to do.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, we're in the really interesting moment where the tools that were once the domain of Hollywood and, room filled with silicon graphic engines are now totally democratized in the hands of almost everybody that can afford a laptop. And that means that different types of image making, different types of storytelling has become accessible. Like when I first started Fiction Entertainment Master's Program, essentially our remit, this is before the rise of game engines and real-time rendering and virtual production. It was essentially some form of a film program, and what we were doing, and our niche was that we were doing Hollywood-level visual effects with indie-style narrative. Because people coming from architecture backgrounds had a certain skill set that someone in a film school didn't, and they could make different types of films. There's a reason why the graduate film coming out of a film school is typically an actor-driven coming-of-age story set in a New York loft apartment. It's entirely shot in camera. There's no visual effects. They literally discourage visual effects and big worlds. Because the traditions of those programs are about utility and what can a student make, and a student can't normally do big imaginary worlds, but now they can. So that was our gap where we were filling, and also because most of us are spatial designers telling stories, we think through worlds and we think through space. So we started making these films that maybe exist more in the domains of science fiction and popular culture, or music videos and commercials that are very visually led as opposed to actor or story led, purely because the tools allowed us to do it. Now AI further pushes that and means that the cinematic is no longer the domain of someone with years and years of training, but it's really accessible. And what that is exciting for architects, because so often the language that we've been operating in, that of the plan, the section, the diagram, is a very coded, very privileged language. We train in schools for 5 to 7 years even sometimes to learn to understand that language. Yet ever since we sit up we're in front of a screen, we fall asleep in the pages of the novel. The language of storytelling, the language of film and images is universal. We're all literate in film in a way that we're not literate in a section.
We talk about that all the time here, right? Like the capacity for video to be immediately accessible is so much greater than even the drawings that we all love and adore, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the tragedies is that like most architecture students that talk about film just end up quoting like Antonioni and Stalker, like they churn out all the same.
Or Blade Runner, or Akira.
Blade Runner's on our board, so be careful, Nate.
Right. But like what's interesting is accessible is normally in disciplinary circles a word that we throw around with derisement. That's so accessible. Biaki's so accessible. He's a sellout. It's rubbish. But accessible can also mean you're being generous to your audience. Totally. And you're finding a way to bring a wider audience that isn't turning up at an architecture review or an architecture lecture into our work, right? And if we, as a discipline, value the ideas that we deal with, it's literally our responsibility. It's negligent not to find ways to give people access to our ideas. And film, animation, video has become a really profound way to do that. And again, which is why the question of audience is really critical. And the audience for the work shouldn't be the institution. The audience for the work should be more general than that, and we should find ways to bring people onto and into the discourse and ideas that we think is valuable about cities and space.
That's a good transition, I think, to our question, or we had a comment on a lot of our content goes out on Instagram, and we sometimes get some comments that we like to bring to the show. One of the comments that we received on an archigram video that Waleed put out, I guess, a week ago or so.
Yeah.
There's this first comment which I love, and we've had this sentiment come up a few times in conversation with our content. But somebody basically says, "What do you do when you love all this stuff, but you can't get a job rearranging pre-made objects in Revit?" Question mark.
Yeah. And so I'll also say that, I mean, we get this all the time. We usually make videos about representation, paper architecture, the term paper architecture, speculative work. It's just, well, actually, I'll let you guys answer the question before I go on a rant. So,
Yeah,
what's your thoughts
how
about
would you
that?
answer this question other than saying come to SCI-Arc immediately?
Yeah, there's always that.
Wait, is the nature of the question how to get a job after, or how to learn to do this?
I can summarize it. The question is essentially to say, like, hey, I can't get a job in architecture, but I love this stuff. I love design. I love the creativity. I love the world building that was even occurring in Archigram, right? But they're feeling maybe a little like, where do I go with this? They're having a hard time seeing how that translates into the, a creative practice, I guess I would say.
Like on TikTok, everyone will say, that's all great and stuff, these conceptual ideas, but clients don't care about that. And they're stuck in the mind of that's the only path they have forward is being an architecture or architect in a profession.
I think it's also, I mean, some of these things get like pretty conflated. I think it's also the idea that there's one single client or one office. I think certainly seeing the graduates from a school like SCI-Arc, that yes, there's a range of students that leave, architecture, or don't leave architecture, but do things kind of tangentially to it. But I also think that, the majority of our students are working in firms. They're also finding firms that, in some cases are doing work that's close to what they're doing. In other cases, it's work that's maybe not as close, but I think they're bringing with them a way of thinking and a way of designing that'll slowly, kind of turn, hopefully that design or kind of that office. But I think sometimes those questions are a bit conflated, where there is this idea there's one type of job or there's one type of office. I think the field is really, really broad, but I do think going to a school that can start to align you with, whether that's offices, whether that's skills, or even a network that lets you move towards those types of jobs. I think it's very hard just to do it, obviously, just on your own or just from anywhere. That there is certain ways you start to kind of put a career together and kind of put those connections in place.
Yeah, I suppose it's on us as educators to sort of frame the skill set that you get while in school. And as we all know, like the academy should be about having some degree of experimentation. But this actually works really well for what's going on across the hall in the career fair. Earlier in studio, we
currently have a career fair, by the way.
There's 30 firms outside this door.
So we required the students to go for a certain slot of time, which is great because they get to interact and network and see what that process is like. But students came back from that and they were like, yeah, I don't really know. They weren't too interested because they're all asking about AutoCAD and Revit. And so, I suppose that helps frame the discussion around like the immediacy of the skill set that you acquire and the role that experimentation plays in the academy and how that.
I think,
go ahead.
I think it's also how we set that up. I mean, we just had our open studio. We had 140 offices came here, so they came here because they wanted these students. I think that's the one thing is like maybe students that are caught in between or kind of doing work that is more self-driven, but is maybe not. I know you guys are doing quite amazing work at RPI, but there's a lot of students, all over the place, and they start from very different, states and places in terms of, state universities or, what the faculty are. But I think at SCI-Arc, if offices are coming, they know a little bit what's going on. They're not shocked. And so we had 140 offices, and that ranges from, alumni like Barbara Bester or, people from Morphosis to kind of offices that have been started by our alumni that are now hiring people. Like Chris Connor would be a good example. And so I think that's also something that helps is as a student, especially in graduate school, starting to place yourself. And likewise, if this is not the work you want to do, then this is not the place to come to get a kind of straightforward, CAD or kind of Revit job. But our students, that was like the highlight of the month was just the energy of that night of kind of open studio. And I was quite shocked because honestly, I've seen a lot of fairly kind of like sad to boring career fairs over the years. And so I think it was just being so clear why you would come here. We also had people come from Sony. I know Liam talked to one of their representatives that night. So there's also people that showed up that weren't from traditional architecture firms at all.
That's
And
fantastic.
they also kind of knew why they were coming here.
Wow.
Yeah, look, I think I'm a pretty straight shooter and pretty blunt. I think it's good to just put everything on the table. There's these shared fictions that operate around architecture schools and the projects that we make as thesis work and stuff, which is that in some way these works set you up or prepare you to work in the discipline in traditional office. Like the majority of work that we might celebrate on your Instagram channel and so on has very little to do with the work that someone's ultimately going to graduate into and work on. Yet we still just kid ourselves that we don't really talk about that. It's just this unspoken thing that just kind of bubbles beneath the surface. I came to SCI-Arc because it was one of these schools where it had a history of people graduating from an architecture program and then going to work, because of LA, going to work in the film industry or going off and doing something else. But it was always done not as something that was legitimate or seen as like a standard pathway that one would follow, but either it was a result of sheer coincidence or luck or just an amazing determined student and a real hustle. But it was never like something that we really just openly talked about. I made this program, Fiction Entertainment, as a means to legitimize the sorts of moves that architects were making anyway, particularly architects graduating out of SCI-Arc, which is to just pull the rug out from this fiction and say that if you want to keep making the type of work that you made as your thesis project, you want to keep doing these beautiful drawings, these beautiful animations, then an architecture office that makes buildings as its primary practice isn't where you need to be.
Yeah.
That's not to say well, you've got to then just do a 9-to-5 thing and then do competition entries on the weekend. But instead, what are the areas that you can operate in? What other jobs could you get that are most closely aligned with the type of work you actually want to be doing? And they may not have anything to do with a traditional office, I guess.
Liam's a little more the pessimist, though. I know last Tuesday we had the annual bowling tournament.
I saw that.
In
Saw
LA.
you posted about it.
I think there was 40 offices represented. A lot of our alumni were there as the ringers, the kind of young power for these teams. But I think that was an example of 40 offices that are all doing work that I would say is not very far from the work that was done at school. A number of those offices are former alumni, are the principals or the founders. But yeah, I think it's true. I don't think every single student, certainly in the US that's graduating, is able to have a continuity from what they were doing in school to what they do after. But I do think that's the fight we're fighting, and I do think we see that in our kind of placement. And just in a night like that, the kind of volume of people in a city like LA that are doing amazing work that's not so far off. And they're still doing beautiful drawings and really, I think, compared to the rest of the country, quite eccentric buildings.
I think something that we talk about a lot is some of these identity crises. I think that's where we're interested, being on the pedagogical side, interested in how we communicate and consume architecture, how we get it out in the world. But I think what you're also talking about is this kind of Wizard of Oz moment where you get in school and then the curtain's pulled back and you're like, oh, the architect is no longer the knight or the hero of the story like we've seen out in the world. You're part of this kind of service industry, or that kind of fantasy is suddenly dismantled. But it doesn't, obviously, I think the conversation we're having is it doesn't have to be dismantled. But I think part of the identity we're struggling against too are all of these shared touch points or crossovers between architectures promoted in popular media or just culturally through Pinterest or HGTV or even I think about things like the mood board, which is really generative and productive even for those of us in design or who are producing and generating from a series of references, but the unexamined version of that is still kind of a touch point for non-designers. It's a miscommunication device, if you will. So
Can I reorient this slightly. Nate, I want to shift to you a little bit here because you've just taken over your role as graduate chair and postgraduate chair at SCI-Arc. And by the way, we were really happy to hear that. Obviously, it was really exciting to hear that happen, and really cool to see you go and see what you do there. We sort of consumed your lecture where you laid out, like, honestly, what I thought was like a really wonderful love letter to to LA, to SCI-Arc, and what its role has been traditionally in the discipline, which was educational for me. Honestly, I feel like I was maybe brainwashed into believing that SCI-Arc was one particular kind of place, but honestly that it holds this kind of really important place in the recent discipline. So the other thing that you brought up that I really enjoyed was, I thought that it was really a call to action, and I highlighted on the Miro board, if you can go down, Maggie, the both and comment that you started with, talking about Venturi and how you kind of brought that up as a theme. And that's actually what helped structure this sort of this conversation today, was thinking about what you are trying to balance here. You're teaching at an architectural institution. You have to take that seriously. It's a NAB accredited institution. You're making architects, but I also think you're at one of the flagship design institutions that leads the country in being an innovative educational institution. We talk about that in terms of obviously what Liam's doing. I can understand how you might be wrestling those two kind of things, and the question of the need for more cultural relevance, and again about audience. Liam, to your point about understanding how we talk to the culture outside of architecture, which that is our mission, by the way. That's MXD's mission. So I feel like that really resonated with us. And the other half of that is the desire to continue the project of architecture, to not say that, hey, it's completely destroyed and broken.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with Liam that I think the idea of like the crit or these things becoming so internalized, I do think that architecture over especially the last 15 years, has siloed itself away. So definitely in each school. I remember being a student, having much more contact with people from a huge range of other fields coming into architecture. Some of them being our actual main theorists and even educators. They had nothing to do with architecture. None of them had a degree in architecture. None of them came from architecture, but they were so interested in architecture, and that was some of what I think I talked about last month in that talk, that's gone. It was a different moment, different generation. I think everyone waited around thinking another group of them would show up, but they didn't. I think instead they moved on to other, like instead of coming to architecture, they just started their own programs, or own disciplines, or own degrees, or own think tanks, and didn't need us. But there was a moment where we were really looked at as the characters that one could synthesize a huge set of information. So again, that goes to what you're doing in school, where you get these kind of briefs that are overloaded. You do them by yourself and you do it in one term. But I think it was also that moment when each student that was really a year or two in, knew like 10 software packages and then how to output the stuff into like 5 different machines. And in every other field, they would know one of those really well, or one way of doing that, but we were just loosely moving between all of it. And I think clearly you see that, in the work of Liam, that kind of agility. And I think some of that's been lost a little bit in general, like the idea of everyone just uses Rhino, and there's one software and it does everything, also seems insane if you went back and asked someone in like 2005. But I think also that we don't have all those people coming through anymore, photographers, philosophers, physicists, like this giant list. And so I don't think that's at all on them. I think it's on us. Like, how did we lose the general public's interest? Part of that was through the spectacle. Part of that was through being blamed for some of the financial crashes in that period. But we haven't made a backup plan in the last 20 years. It's like we're just waiting for all that to come back, or like looking for the next country that has global capital to go back to doing what we were doing 20 years ago.
And it may not come back. That's the reality.
I hope it doesn't. I think it was a broken model. That's definitely how I was educated. And I think why we've been in a holding pattern, because we were all educated and now waiting for something to come back that is just gone. And that's just the cycles of how things go. You sometimes catch it at the beginning, sometimes the middle. I think we caught that moment at the end. And so that's why I think it's a time to rethink where we're at and where we go. But we can't go anywhere without a public. It's not even just a client. I think it's also just the public imagination, which used to be really at least far more interested in architecture than it is. The last thing I'll say is it is funny that in the last 5 years, though, the amount of architectural representation that's popular on Instagram, like for 100 years, the only people that were buying, drawings were in galleries in New York or, expensive etchings in Italy. Like this was not a widespread thing. But now the amount of without people even knowing this, but an axon or a floor plan or just a bunch of our bits and pieces because of something like Instagram or Pinterest are all over. And you guys know the club quarters in Philadelphia where the faculty would always stay.
Yeah.
They after COVID they redid all their cheap in the room art. It's all knockoff Piranesi sketches and analytiques.
Awesome.
So in some ways it's our representation's never been more out there, but yet I think the interest in what we do or why you would need us is down, and I think that's on
100%.
us. It's not on
Can I
the
jump in here
general
real quick? There's an idea, and I like what you're saying, and the fact that you brought up maybe the past where, well, you brought up two things that stuck out. One is a speculative project and what that role was, and maybe that's what brought in a lot of photographers and other people that maybe they were seen they weren't allowed to by their parents to go study photography. I hear that all the time.
Totally.
That was my story.
Yeah, and I know a lot of people like that where
I
they
hear that
weren't
a
allowed
lot.
to study art. So the only thing that's acceptable and close enough would be architecture, right? And so now there's things that are acceptable as seen as professions that now has changed people. They're kind of at least their outlook of saying, okay, I don't need to study architecture anymore. That was my way out and kind of getting funding from my parents, but now I don't need that. And I think that's interesting. That's part of the shift in my biased opinion. The other thing is kind of the obsessive nature of what the speculative project now is. I think there's a lot of speculative projects. I think my studios definitely lean on the speculative, but it's a very different speculative than, let's say, Archigram or Perry Culper or Libius Woods. It's a very different type of speculative project. I would say those people probably wanted to be something else, but end up in architecture for some strange reason. Or maybe again, the landscape was different. I can't speak to it. I wasn't alive or active in the profession back then. But that was a shift that I think is interesting. And what we were left with, as you were mentioning, is the idea of the image. And Instagram and Pinterest has made the image so powerful, and maybe our attentions to it is fragile and it's very temporary. Where I guess, Liam, your projects deal with films and people lean into films. Your projects kind of seem like they deal with a reoccurring world or narrative, it's in the same universe, and that builds on narrative. On fandom. And I think a lot of us love fandom. And even when things look like Piranesi-like, that leans on that fandom. And I think the images of, let's say, the 1990s architecture competitions, those were so elitist. And look, I love those projects. I am a fan of those, but most people cannot tap into that and say, I get it, because it's a conceptual project, nor can they be fans of it. I'm talking about the general masses, and I'm kind of obviously generalizing here. But that speculative project that was trying to be conceptually speculative and also professionally speculative, meaning their speculative projects are trying to get built. They're these very famous competitions, and we actually have some of them that we want to show. What we're seeing are competition projects like this, right? And so now you're building these domestic projects, or anybody in general, where maybe you're inputting speculative ideas, contemporary ideas, but now you have to look back into history and say look at the things I was obsessed with, because this is the stuff that everyone in architecture school thought was amazing in terms of its images, because the publications only published this work, and people cared more about the image itself, to be honest, in my opinion, than the project itself, than it being actually built. And so I think what we're seeing now is an evolution of being obsessed with the image. So all that to say is, I think that the obsession with the image was there back then, but it was curated by an elitist set of publications and conferences, where now it's so disrupted that the normal house, the domestic house, is seen as, the HGTV house is seen as a beautiful project that people want to obsess over.
Can I add to that really quick before Nate responds? Because Nate, I also wanted to tell you, on a personal level, that I really appreciated the way that you talked about practice in that lecture, because I think a lot of us that are young and trying to start a practice, and frankly doing the kind of projects you were describing, feel like that's really not appreciated, especially in academia. So I loved your honesty and vulnerability to say, look, it takes a long time to build a practice, but also we shouldn't shun these kind of projects. We should encourage our students to take them on seriously. And that's another way to expand our audience, is to say that architecture does not have to be inaccessible. So I thought that your way of framing your own work was really refreshing in that lecture.
Well, I would say to go read. It's probably 5 years old now, but Emmett Zifman, who's going to be here next week, we're going to do an event on Friday that's going to be a debate around issue 64 of Log. But if you go back 5 years ago, he wrote a piece in Log about notes on collective form, and there's a paragraph or two in there towards the end where he addresses something we never talk about, which is that we all come from not just different educations, but very different places. And I think it's a negligence that we also don't ever address that with students. That the idea of coming from money or not, and what you could do in terms of practice or teach or not have to build.
Right.
So I came from a situation where, middle class. I wanted to be a photographer. My parents were very clear to me, like, how would you ever fund that? What are you talking about? And so I found my way into architecture as like a major I could check the box, and it had something to do with art, but I didn't know what it was, and then I ended up being at the school that was obsessed with contemporary at Ohio State. I went to the school that was in my state that was essentially the biggest architecture school there, but also the most affordable. I didn't know anything about those characters or about the shows at the Wexner Center. So I got lucky in that sense and was turned on to this thing. I don't know at other schools if I would have stuck with architecture or if I would have found some way back to photography, but I really loved it. I loved my faculty, and I loved even those early jobs I did in Columbus. And so, by the end of it, I was obsessed with being an actual architect. So I'm a registered architect, and I want to practice. But that also meant my wife comes from essentially the same background and is an architect. You guys know her, but we had to work. We weren't ever able to like just take time off or build our own house or do something. It was always we had to build this up. And so that's why we were at one point I was teaching at 3 schools. We were always practicing, which in that case meant small projects in New York City alongside teaching. Emmett in that essay started to kind of really poke at that and say, why don't we call this out, but why don't we talk about this and also let students know that is going to impact to some degree what you can do, especially right out of school. It doesn't mean you're limited, forever, but not everybody is Philip Johnson that can, for their thesis project, turn nothing in and just build themselves a house in Cambridge.
Right.
And so I think it's a kind of, that's like another episode, but it's something I feel like as generations move on, they're talking about a bit more.
Yeah.
But it's still like a weird taboo for us.
Absolutely. Just because of time, we really want to move into, and we'll come collect this back. Liam, we want to jump into your work. Obviously, you had an exhibition, or I think it's currently going on still at SCI-Arc. I think the visuals are stunning. I think it speaks to kind of a contemporary education model, a contemporary kind of maybe cultural obsession that we can get into, tap into more.
I guess there's two buckets here to discuss. One, Liam, is just your work. And actually, I would be curious to hear, my curiosity for you would honestly just be about how you developed your own voice as kind of a cinematographer, as a filmmaker, and then how you then brought that to the program or how you teach something like that. But we can go in a lot of different directions here.
I mean, maybe like for the audience's sake, I'm sure a lot of people know who you are, but you're an architect, like you studied architecture. Let's say a student maybe that maybe felt like you, that doesn't know your story. Like, how do you go from being an architect and then transitioning into this world of entertainment and fiction and the obsession of narrative and the mediums of technology that gets you there?
And I think I want to jump in too and ask Liam also, like, what you feel about kind of the tropes or the rehashed ideas of envisioning the future, and maybe where you fit into that or where you challenge maybe the tropes of what's come before in world making and kind of the different avenues that we could take going forward. Maybe a clearer question of that I wanted to ask of the 4 films that are showing behind you, are they all in the same world or universe? Are they different? Like, are they totally different worlds or conditions that you're showing? I don't. Hopefully that made sense.
Sorry, we threw like 6 questions at you.
Yeah, pick whatever you want, man. Pick whatever you want.
Pick one.
Start at the beginning.
Yeah, let me start at the beginning. Maybe we'll on the journey we'll hit some of those, but by all means, come back to me with anything that I've missed. Look,
Sure.
I also want to say as a start, I mean, Nate as part of his position as like a new flag bearer for SCI-Arc needs to be much more far less dilettante than I can afford to be in my role running my little island. But I do think I mean yes, I'm a pessimist because a lot of conversations I have with students that end up coming to my program are all trying to escape architecture,
Right.
right,
Right.
and are broken from however many years that they've been in that cycle, and they're coming to me to try and achieve escape velocity. So I'm constantly in those conversations of, look, my parents made me do this thing, but they've given me 1 year where I can try something else. That's why I'm coming to you. So maybe that's where my pessimism comes from. But deep down, I still think that an architectural education is the greatest 5 years that anyone could possibly spend in school, right? Like, now I know what I do. I'm an artist. I make imaginary worlds. I make films. I wouldn't tell little Liam at 17 like not to go into
Yeah.
architecture school.
Right.
Right. I think
You
that the work
clearly
that I
still
make-
love architecture.
Well, yeah, I'm still in an architecture institution because they were it's I think the space where I can do the most interesting stuff and I can be the most helpful and productive. But also, like, I think that the education that we have as architects is really suited to the moment that we find ourselves in, right? Like, it's one of those last disciplines that sits in between culture and technology, where we do a class in philosophy here at SCI-Arc with Graham Harmon. We do a class in coding with Casey. We do vacuum form collage models of stuffed teddy bears with Florencia.
Awesome.
Like,
That was 2 years ago. We've moved on.
okay, now we do,
That's awesome, though. I want to see it.
now we compress flowers and vacuum form.
Also
those, I
cool.
think. Or we do a life drawing class. We can walk into a bar and have a cool conversation with a filmmaker or an engineer, and there's very few disciplines left that have that kind of dexterity. So I love what we do in these contexts. My great disappointment and my pessimism comes from the fact that, not at SCI-Arc, I hope, but at a lot of other schools, that extraordinary training is deployed to do essentially a luxury service industry for the mega rich, where the pinnacle of the profession to a lot of people is building trophies for despots in the Middle East, or millionaire beach houses that are lived in for 2 weeks of the year. And I think that's a tragedy and an extraordinary waste of the talents and the skills that we acquire in education. So I came out of a school that no one's heard of in a tiny town in Australia. It wasn't a glamorous education, but I came out with this bursting set of ideas and skills. So I went off and got a job in the biggest, most famous office I could imagine. I started working in Zahad's office in London, at a really great moment before it turned into the mega Patrick office that it is now.
Yes.
She was still there. She taught me how to paint. She taught me how to draw with ink pens and make models. But I was still doing those big museum projects, and I wanted to affect change in cities. And I didn't see that avant-garde of the profession being a space where that was happening, because at the time, things like the emergence of drone technologies, autonomous vehicles, access to the network, like these were the things that were starting to shape urban experiences. Our social lives in cities were now being defined not by the structures and formations and architecture of the piazza, but by the platform. Mitigated through rules defined by a dude in hoodies and sneakers, not constructed through a public elected government, and certainly not constructed through the politics of an architecture project. So I moved away. That was the last office I ever worked for. So I started dealing in the realms of speculation, starting to make films, starting to tell stories, because that futuring seemed to be the only way that you could keep pace with the pace of technology. What I call before culture technologies that are coming into the world faster than our capacity to understand what they might mean, might emerge. And that it was purely by chasing a space where I could, as an architect, be effective, that I landed in the film industry, or I landed in a kind of an art practice, because I was just trying to find spaces where that skill set would be meaningful. And doing futures consulting, for car company trying to rebrand themselves as a mobility company because of driverless vehicles were breaking their business model. Trying to talk to various governments that were trying to understand digital infrastructure as a service, just like water is. That became really interesting. So the nature of the work just evolved because of it. And then, what flowed from that is then the need and the hope that I might also help other architecture graduates with a similar kind of anxiety or a similar set of desires find ways where they could be effective and where they could operate, to start to make a program that would help people be architects, but be architects inside the film industry or the video game industry or within politics or within a curatorial practice or within the art world.
Just ask one quick follow-up question though, like when you maybe arrive at SCI-Arc and you're looking at this as a pedagogy instead of just a passion, right? Like I would just ask you about that a little bit. Like what is that like to even theorize about a program that trains architects in this way? I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about it. And even I love that we started by talking about the crit and your skepticism of it, because clearly you've thought a lot about how the pedagogical structure of architecture school has to be adjusted to make this kind of work, and clearly it's working. So I'm curious what you were thinking on that is, or how you got to this place. But
yeah, it's still like I talk about the program as it's a 3-month master's. It's a full calendar year, which when you're in it feels very short. But I talk about it as a year of specialization. Where a lot of people that come into the program, we take in people from film school, from BFAs and so on, but the architects that come into the program, they've done 5 years of an undergrad. Maybe they've worked for a couple of years in an office. They have an extraordinary capacity already. But just like someone that's done an undergraduate medical degree, there's a series of years and practical training and specializations where someone decides that they want to focus in on pediatrics or be an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. My program is a year of specialization, just like that, for the folks that want to work in film, work in video games, work in immersive experiences or stage design or animation. They've got a lot of those skills already, but they just need a year to maybe fill in the gaps with some more specialized ways of working that are unique to the industries they want to land in.
Casp, can I just add one thing to this? Like, what's special from what I read from the program that you guys have at SCI-Arc, entertainment and fiction, would be there's like, instead of doing crits, you mentioned that, at least in the article I read, you talk about like a mentor program. Can you just speak a bit more about that and like how you think that makes SCI-Arc's program specifically more valuable than just a traditional, even like art school?
Well, maybe also because you're good at taking multiple questions at once.
Yeah.
I think you should mention at least four of the people that were involved in this show as being kind of outside of architecture, and maybe even within a year of the program. I think this is a place where a lot of these outside thinkers, designers, or completely other fields are coming in. I mean, I'm still impressed you worked with John Cale. So you're someone who is very much not just sitting in any one field. It's not even just film.
Cool.
But I would add that on to Waleed's question.
Yeah. I mean, I'm an extreme pragmatist. If you want to work in the film industry, you got to meet a bunch of film directors. If you want to be a production designer, you should be taught by a bunch of production designers. And this is especially true in the context of video games. Like, it's very hip to like run an architecture and video game program. Lots of people are doing it now. But for the most part, it's a bunch of architects that know Unreal Engine. So the structure of my program is pretty unique, right? Like most architecture studios, you do a midterm review or a final review. At best, they're the moments when you might speak to someone from outside of the school. So depending on the interest of the student in every given year, if someone wants to do stage design for music festivals, then I bring in a ton of people that work in stage design for music festivals. And oftentimes these are mega famous people that do amazing work, but because of the networks I've built across my practice, or because of the reputation of the program now after 10 years here, instead of bringing them in to do a public lecture for 300 people, it might happen in the way that might happen at other schools, we can bring them in to sit down next to a student like this and just talk about the work. And that's for us what a review becomes. It becomes a supportive conversation, not with someone who's assessing or judging the work, but with someone who's becoming a mentor.
Maybe I could take this opportunity to shift gears a little bit. I think that was great, and I think it makes me. I want to come to your program, Liam. I'll be there next year.
You didn't list some of the names.
Oh yeah.
Hype the show.
Right.
The show.
Oh,
Hype the
yes,
show.
hype the show.
So I mean, it's a precursor for a much larger show that happens in the summer at the Barbican, where there's 1 million people coming in. But
Wow.
My practice is world building, which is a big undertaking and shouldn't be considered alone. So I bring in science fiction authors, like Kim Stanley Robinson wrote a story for this show. Lisa Joy Nolan, who's the creator of Westworld, the TV show, and Fallout. She wrote a story set inside one of the worlds that we created.
Cool.
There's amazing voice actors now that are going to record those stories for the Barbican as audio dramas. There's a famous Australian Aboriginal actress, Natasha Wanganeen, who authored one of these worlds with me called After the End. But there's also amazing networks of scientists that collaborate on these projects with us. Essentially, what I'm trying to suggest is that, and to counter some of the questions that we had earlier around speculation, is that I'm not the genius architect, sitting alone doing a napkin sketch and overlaying my image of the future upon an unsuspecting, idiotic public.
And just sorry to ask the question: are these all in the same universe? I think Christian asked the question before. Are the worlds
Planetary Imaginaries is an exhibition of 4 worlds. They're all coming from the same place. They're all interconnected, but they're not necessarily all the same story, right?
Yeah.
But in using this word, planetary imaginary, and also in advocating for architects operating within the medium of speculation, what I'm trying to suggest is that the way that we connect with and relate to our future has always been conditioned by the stories and the images we create about futures,
Totally.
As disseminated in popular culture. And it's really, really important that we come to some shared values around the futures that we want to live in. And I think there's a critical role that both architects, designers, storytellers, image makers can play in shaping what those futures are. Because historically, the futures we imagine always end up becoming the futures that we live in. And in that way, as we start to make these images and write these stories, in a way we're making and writing the world, and therefore storytelling becomes actually a really critical act of architecture and urbanism. And that's why I make this work, but also it's why I collaborate with all these multidisciplinary people to try and make the work rich and layered and complex and nuanced, but also pragmatic and real.
Yeah. I think maybe that would take us into the next topic, because I actually was going to basically go in that direction. One thing I was going to just bring up that I really liked about the way you were talking about the work, like how we view speculation about the future in the public domain, right? And how that has kind of been, influencing us as designers and thinkers. And I really like the way that you talk about realism in that context, or maybe sort of a way of saying this is not science fiction. The thing I've always appreciated about your work is that it always feels like a very possible and near and possibly real future. It doesn't feel like it's relying on the magic turn that something coming out of nowhere, right? So I really like the way that you talk about this as sort of possible futures, right? And it's a narrative that lets us talk about something that maybe we can't always talk about. So the thing for us that was fun to think about was in architecture, that speculation often, like we were talking about archigram earlier, that speculation is often just as fictional and just as maybe rich and deep in certain ways. But the product feels imaginary and very untangible to some degree. But I think, what is your take on realism in this context? Because I think that's important.
Yeah, we use the phrase fiction or science fiction, which implies that somehow these things don't exist. But I guess what I'm just trying to argue for is that all of these stories have very real consequence.
Right.
They mean something, and these fictions that we create, they have weight, and they get applied into the world with such force that they find traction. which is why I'm interested in making this kind of work. Like, we used to think about the idea of science fiction as being some kind of mechanism of prediction. In the 60s and 70s, sci-fi was this place where you would imagine wild possibilities. You know, Jetsons envisioned like flying cars and robot butlers and food in pill form, like things we couldn't possibly we projected in the mediums of science fiction. The nature of science fiction has totally changed today, because technology is no longer this thing of wonder, like something that might happen in the distant future. But now we're in a world where we have all this technology, and we just don't know what it means. We don't know what its consequences are. Like, AI is a thing that's here. It's literally on our phones. But what it means as a culture, as a labor force, as a creative community, we just have no idea about.
Totally.
So science fiction is now a medium in which we explore the consequences of tech that's already here, right?
And in a way, your work is maybe the best way we have of exploring that future, because we just simply don't have other means to talk about it.
Yeah, exactly. The currency through which we typically talk about technology is these science fiction images, right? But you know, they offer really insights into who we are. So, you know, we're looking at Blade Runner right now, which I think is extraordinary. Again, it's, you know, almost a cliche in the context of architecture schools as a film reference. But the way that it really operates is that it's this extraordinary document of the fears and anxieties of the 80s in America, the time in which it was made, right? The context where Blade Runner emerges is the beginning of the personal electronics boom. And that's what Cyberpunk was. It was a way of wrestling with the beginnings of the future that we're currently all inhabiting. And it was a way of exercising those fears, because at the time, like, everything was being outsourced from America. American industry was collapsing. Everything cool was being made in Japan. For the first time, we had, you know, personal electronics and a home VHS video recorder and a Sony Walkman. So we imagined this future, which was this hybrid, like, Asian American universe, but it was purely out of that moment. And it's not that, like, Blade Runner didn't get it right. It's that it was an amazing time capsule. And that's, I think, the way that all of these futures can start to operate. You know, so I'm a big fan of the genres of science fiction, the way that cyberpunk morphed into solar punk or had an offshoot of steampunk. I say that the work that I make is they're artifacts and images of what I describe as a form of planetary punk, which is a new model of science fiction that's trying to image large-scale planetary transformations, you know, geoengineering schemes, massive climate remediation.
I love that.
Because I think these are the types of images that we need today. If cyberpunk was imagery that helped us reckon with the personal electronics boom, then planetary punk is the types of images that help us reckon with climate change and the necessary things that we need to do as designers, architects, politicians, urbanists, and so on, in order to mitigate this future and somehow survive it.
Well, and even the goal of Planetary Imaginaries being able to shift our perception from maybe singular space, singular building, singular project to planetary understanding. So.
I mean, as a reductivist type of person that I am, like, I'm really drawn to your work due to its, like, imagery, its cultural aesthetic, and it's one of the reasons why I like cyberpunk as a genre and all its, like, offshoots. And, like, I wonder, like, one, how you teach aesthetics, because there's clearly an underlying cyberpunk-esque, I'll use that loosely, aesthetic. But for me, I like the cyberpunk, especially like the game Cyberpunk 2077, because it's very political. Like, I'm trying to, like, create this series on cyberpunkness in general, and knowing that during the 80s is, like, kind of rounding off the end of the Cold War. It's a lot of politics built behind it. I mean, everything that you mentioned, of course, that was happening. That's, like, the technology that was emerging, but also the kind of dystopian kind of cloud over this genre deals with kind of Cold War politics, in my opinion. And it's interesting that you're talking about the planetary punk deals with a different type of politics, right? And I just wonder, like, how do you negotiate aesthetics between projects? There's definitely a futurism behind them, but, like, how do you define the aesthetics of what that future is? I mean, we talk about hybrid cultures. Just like kind of a curious question on aesthetics.
Yeah, I mean, I try not to teach aesthetics. I mean, like, a big part of my program is a resistance to the trend that often happens in architecture education where students try to mimic their professors. So, I get a little bit queasy when I see one of the projects in the cold crit canon that, like, if anyone's looking at the imagery behind, like, I'm sure is directly referencing some of the frames, the literal frames from my film, which is, very flattering, but also I think, I don't know, whoever was teaching that project, like, there's questions you have to ask there, because I'm interested in helping students find their own voice and develop their own language, not replicate mine. The last thing I'm interested
or those tropes.
Sorry?
Or those tropes.
All those tropes.
Like the oil rig. And,
Although, like, as a counter to
fog.
that, as a counter,
it's not the first place it's shown up.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But as a counter to that, I think a lot of people in general, just like the general masses, they like to lean on these tropes. Like, I kind of like to lean towards the familiar aesthetic. I think that is powerful. Now, as a creative, I understand maybe the resistance towards it because we are maybe trying to find an innovative narrative. But I think there is a genre that people, like, if they find a familiar genre, like we talk like about familiarity here, they're probably going to be more attracted towards it. I think there's something in the work that you do, Liam, that I'm super attracted to. That's familiar yet novel. And I know what you're saying, but like, I guess I am just curious about how aesthetics or the form or the worlds get developed.
Where does that come into play
Yeah.
in the teaching process, Liam? Like, I actually am, because you mentioned trying to help students find their own voice, and that's something we always debate here, is like, how do we actually do that without having a heavy hand? I want to know how you think about that, because I think that's actually difficult, especially for something as sophisticated as cinematography, as understanding and thinking through that. I mean, I feel like that's something that's difficult to teach. It's sensibility, right?
Yeah, but it's also that, I mean, when I say I try not to teach aesthetics, it's that I try to not guide a student's aesthetics, but rather I teach the history of aesthetics so they can come at that question with a really critical eye. Like, I think, as Nate mentioned, like, there are tropes that I actually think in certain ways are really useful, right? Like, I lean on the genres of cyberpunk in my own aesthetics because there's a kind of a shorthand that we have from the history of science fiction that says, like, if I see this kind of imagery, I kind of know I'm looking at a future. And it does what we talk about in film language, which is exposition. Exposition means, like,
Here's what's going on.
How do you explain to an audience what they need in order to understand and engage with the story you're trying to tell? And you can lean on tropes to do that because we've already built up a vocabulary through which we can read them. But at the same time, there's an attempt to make them your own. Like, the aesthetics of my work comes out of the history of the sublime. Right?
Absolutely.
And when Nate talks about, like, the oil rig and the mist and the fog, it's a recasting of the sublime, is what David Nides described as the technological sublime, right? That, Caspar David Friedrich is no longer standing on the edge of the cliff looking out across the mist-filled valley, but instead standing on the shoreline looking at the mega oil rig traveling out to sea, because we no longer have an awe of nature. We've controlled and remade nature in our own image. Now we have an awe of the massive pieces of technology, like the giant, like backlit excavator that's behind me right now. That is what gives us that same sense of both wonder and terror. So I'm interested in co-opting the history of the sublime and that form of image in my work. And there's other photographers and people that I would, see as contemporaries, like Edward Batinsky and so on, that are remaking that sublime in that same way. So it's really about trying to imagine, both for myself, but also when teaching students, like, who are the fellow travelers? Like, who are the people that they might be referencing or be inspired by, that then might inform their own aesthetic, encourage students to understand how an aesthetic emerges and the context in which they're making work, and hopefully they can then start to find their own voice within those reference points.
Cool.
Liam, I have a question. So if you had a student who came to you with let's say like a Simpsons aesthetic, and as a way to tell their story, how would you go about that?
You might have one.
Yeah, I'm sure it's happened all the time. Yeah, like, again, like, the project is the program is very multidisciplinary, and there's, like, we had a student 2 years ago that was essentially doing like a Dr. Seuss book.
Cool.
none of like a lot of this work is something that I wouldn't like as an artist and filmmaker and director making my own work, I wouldn't come anywhere near. But that's not. I don't think that's the role of educators. Maybe in certain parts of the school, in certain studios, that makes sense. But in post-grad education, which for the most part is the last time a student is going to be in a school, like the idea that they're going to like copy a professor, or even that I should be telling them and making judgments on their aesthetic, I find that really troubling. So yeah, if someone comes with a Simpsons vibe, then I want to like connect them to the history of animation and start to talk about, well, like who is Matt Groening looking at and being inspired by? Let's look at those folks too. And it's an aesthetic that comes out of the means of production of the early days of the Simpsons. The means of production now are different. So what does your aesthetic start to look like in a way that connects with the tools that you're using to make it?
Something that comes to mind, because I'm just mired in this, like, what are the ideologies embedded in these different worlds and the worlds that we're putting out there. But I feel like an interesting touch point, arguably, that I'd like to tease out a little bit is like between sci-fi or speculation, however we want to call it, and current obsessions in architecture with the everyday, which, Nate, you also spoke to, I think, in your lecture from last month. But right, like there are some of that strangeness or tension in sci-fi is both the way technology is deployed and used socially, politically, and otherwise. But sci-fi is also always connected to, I think, as Caleb was saying, like the real or the everyday. But I think maybe problematically there is it's the everyday cast through a very particular lens, through a very like mundane, maybe dull or sad or banal lens is how the everyday is cast. And so I think we're also having to ask ourselves, like, whose everyday are we living and seeing through? And Nate, I thought you kind of posed that question, if I'm remembering correctly in your lectures, like, yeah, looking at the everyday in contrast to this future that maybe never arrives is very important. But then we have to look at, like, how are we casting the everyday, or how are we imaging it? How are we showing that to ourselves or evaluating that to ourselves? So I just wanted to point that out, because I think that's a part of world building that I love, is like the grunge and the everyday and the use. But I have to see it also as a particular way of looking at that stuff that isn't true everywhere. So
she's a
Well, I
true
think-
grunge maxer.
I am a grunge maxer.
That's the truth.
Part of that for me came out of, I think it's been building up for a couple of years, but this, it's not just in architecture, but this like bizarre, part of the interest in the familiar or the everyday was to kind of reset after the spectacle and after the crash. I think then you saw, like, if leading up to that, everything was about novelty or the newness. So after that, you started to hear words like ambiguity, almost, and strange. Like strange became big, not just in certainly in architecture, but like the rise of something like True Detective. This thing that was massively popular and was all about a kind of strangeness and things being just a little bit off. So it was, I think happening on a lot of different levels. And then the next step of that was this kind of return to the everyday, but the everyday seemed to be a very luxurious version. And that was kind of my point, that I think the everyday of Target in 2000 was actually pretty interesting in terms of materiality and color and even form or shape. But the everyday all of a sudden was like the everyday of Succession, where you were wearing super, super expensive clothing that looked kind of bland. And so, yes, the everyday, I think, like you were just saying, was somehow associated with like blandness or dullness or simplicity, or there was all these terms thrown around, but to me, they were actually all terms that spoke to money and to wealth, but then almost a weird concealment of it. Same within architecture. You started to get all these very expensive museums with a gable roof, and these things that were everyday, but actually museums were never a house, so that doesn't even make any sense. And so to me, again, it was a longer fight that had been going on for decades just to suppress some of maybe the outrageousness, which needed to be checked, but also, definitely some of that speculation and even some of the technology that other architects were not comfortable with. So to put the sci-fi and speculation back in a box and be very comfortable doing the projects that really wealthy clients would be really comfortable with. And I think that's what we're kind of facing right now. And I think a lot of schools are really, I don't know, leaning into that in a way. And to me, it's actually the status quo. Like, it's actually very politically dangerous to say we'll be nostalgic and we'll do the familiar, or we'll go back to what we were doing 30 years ago architecturally. To me, it's you know, a very, very odd stance to then say that architects are somehow progressive or looking forward. So maybe it's not looking forward as aggressively as we were 25 years ago, where maybe sci-fi and cinema were really in lockstep with studio culture, you know. So maybe it is something different. That's where I would say, like, I love like lo-fi sci-fi. So for me, Blade Runner was never it. Like, maybe from Ridley Scott, I would take like Alien or the Apple commercial, but like I would take John Carpenter or like World on a Wire. Like, you know, there's a bunch of other examples, and I think like today there's a lot of great examples. But that's also because I don't think there's one way of speculating, and I think there's not one way of architecture, but we're getting a little bit of this like almost oppressive argument that we should all be doing this luxurious every day, and that somehow that's like the safe bet. But to me, it's a really dangerous kind of just like leaning into the status quo and kind of giving up.
Right.
Hey, Nate, so I guess this is an attempt to sort of tie in together what both you and Liam are talking about around pedagogy. It's a two-part question, again, sorry. But at what stage in the curriculum would you say a student is equipped to, or architects are equipped to, address some of these questions about familiarity versus speculation? And as far as for Liam, like it's in terms of taste making, I feel like I know how you would respond to it, but I think as an educator, you have to start somewhere with the students, and we only can draw from what we're comfortable with to some degree, I guess.
I mean, for me, I think it's a thing that starts at the beginning of the curriculum. I mean, I've seen what you guys do at RPI, and I think you guys are starting with both early on as well. I think that I've taught comprehensive studios for a decade, and they're the way we had structured them, they were the same as an option studio. So it wasn't that you do, you know, 3/4 of your architecture education doing abstraction, and then or kind of like, you know, wild speculation, and then for one semester you get an engineer and you get serious, whatever that means. For me, it's both of them always at once, and it's understanding that if you really want to speculate, you should also really be thinking about how would you build that, who would you need to help make that happen, and how would you connect that to somebody, you know. So I think it's trying to, for me, that's like a pedagogical problem in question, is where these have become weird binaries, and schools deciding they're one or the other, or even that the curriculum sometimes does one, sometimes does the other. For me, it's that they start at the beginning and they're always there. I think that's the only way to get to that other question from earlier, that you leave school and could continue thinking and practicing equally, and not be stuck kind of in one or the other.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that, like, when students come to a program, like, they're not replicants that have just slid out of a plastic bag.
They're not?
You know, with no
No,
prior
Caleb.
Are you
experience
sure?
of the world. Like, we reckon with this struggle between the familiar and the speculative, you know, since childhood. You know, like, it's something we always do, and like, to kind of wait or hold back, like denies these people as human beings that are existing in the world. I mean, maybe I'm fortunate in running a postgrad program that I get people that, like, to a large extent have lived a big chunk of their lives and kind of start to understand who they are already as people. And I just want to build on that. But you know, there's a tendency in architecture, and hopefully this is, you know, ending soon, but like already has, that in some way part of the architectural education is to pull someone apart as a means to rebuild them again. And, you know, the horrors of the crit, where people deliberately try to make a student cry, like, you know, that's part of that. But I think it denies the fact that these are people, and they have worldviews, they have background, and they have context. And again, in my attempt to try and help someone find their own voice, a big part of what I do is think about, you know, who they are before they get to me, and then I don't think about where they want to get to, and then we kind of, you know, work backwards and fill in the gaps in a way. So I think that there's no right time to start these things. It's something that we reckon with as humans, and it's just to try and acknowledge that and weave that into the practice of architectural education.
I think that's a really good answer. Let's go to some fun topics. We're gonna have Christiana walk us through something. Oh, I guess also the URPs are just showing me a picture of me as a Simpsons character. That's terrifying.
Are we gonna go to?
That's creepy.
Okay.
By the way,
awesome.
we do call these segments as fun topics. It's not that
No, yeah, it's not that your topic's not fun. It's that
we always call them fun topics.
It's that we are so dumb. We need tags for these topics.
Smaller, so small part 2.
Oh no!
Oh
please,
my
God,
gosh,
no.
we did not prepare that.
That's me, by the way, as a pixel character.
I didn't prepare it for today, but I was actually going to ask if either of you play D&D because we have a
Please don't.
architecture
Please don't.
D&D.
Please don't
do
No,
this.
we're not. I didn't prepare it, but we have a whole character list. Our spells are like split and isolate.
Yeah, guys, we're doing really important work here. Okay. All right.
But the topic for today is ongoing conversation I think we all have here because we all play video games in some extent, and I've been obsessed with watching different people who walk through Cyberpunk 2077 that Waleed mentioned earlier. I don't play it, but if I were to play, I would play in a very specific way. And I guess I won't give that no, I guess I could unpack it. Like,
Well, yeah, you have to tell us now.
She doesn't know how to play video games, so she walks around.
No, but I love exploring the world. I just want to like go and see different parts of the map. I don't want to have to feed my character. I don't want to defend against the gangs or get a job or have to sleep somewhere. Actually, my friend said he was invited by a gang to live in the desert in Cyberpunk 2077, which yes, I would get on board with that. But anyway, that's how or Red Dead. I mean, I want to see the environmental stuff in Red Dead because I've heard it's like quite amazing. They've got 200 species that each have their own diet, fear response,
Are we
etc.
sure that the name Captain No Fun should go to Matt?
Oh, I'm no fun. Yeah, I know. I'm old lady, no fun.
I mean, you're also speaking to a culture of not playing video games, but watching it on Twitch and stuff, which is what I do now. And something about like observing the video game kind of culture. Just like, I mean, you and I both watched a video of people in Cyberpunk that are like not going to play the game. They're just going to live life normally for a week where they like work at a restaurant. They realize in Cyberpunk there are no kitchens in the house, so they have to like all eat out of vending
Have
machines.
you guys
and
heard
shit.
about this, Nate and or Liam?
Well, and to summarize, the question
I
is
have teenagers. I live with teenagers.
So
I actually know all this stuff.
Okay,
Nice,
good,
nice, nice.
good.
And one we've been talking about lately too is arc raiders. Seems really interesting because you can like team up with people to.
What's the question?
Yeah. Sorry.
Wait, just to be clear, they are my children.
We understood that. I assumed.
I would hope.
The question embedded in there is how if you play video games, how do you play, or how would you like to play? Do you have a preference for like? Are you just like
Liam, are you-
like D&D?
Yeah.
Are you just out to get into fights, or are you exploring the world and the lore?
Or trying to finish finish the narrative, or like 100% complete the entire game. What kind of gamer are you? I guess.
Yeah, what kind of a gamer
These
are you?
guys are way too busy to play video games. Do either of you play video
What do
games?
you mean?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a occupational hazard, unfortunately.
Oh yes, yes.
I'm forced to play everything, but
Good.
in being forced to play everything, you can't really play anything.
Right.
So I get little glimpses of it so I can say when a student says, "Oh, it's kind of like this game," I can say, "Yeah, I know that game." So I don't finish anything. I start stuff. And then wander
If you
around
had
a
your
bit,
choice, though,
test
what do
out
you
the
like?
mechanics.
Like,
Yeah,
what kind of game do you like?
That's
If you had
a
your choice.
follow-up. What's your
But
favorite?
I like walking sims. I like
Nice.
games that are essentially like interactive stories.
Hell yeah.
That's my vibe because again, I approach game making from someone who's trained as an architect. So I'm not like the fight sim guy. I'm not, in driving games. Although I'm a Formula One fan, like I want to watch it, not like pretend to be a Formula One driver. I want to be immersed in stories.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite or top several in that category?
Oh my! I mean, all the classics. What Remains of Edith Finch, Gone
Final
Home,
Fantasy.
Oregon Trail.
I take you
but
as a Death Stranded type of person. I don't know if you've played it.
Yeah, I mean that's like that's a war of attrition. Like that's like that's a real project to play
Yeah.
Death Stranding. You know what I mean? Like I
I have to be honest, I haven't played it because it's too intense. So
Well, it's also like, I mean, it's basically like it's a movie with a bunch of walking around in between. You know what I mean? Like there's like it's like 40 hours of cutscenes.
Yeah.
Of Death
Yes,
Stranding,
that's right.
Right. And I'm just kind of like, I just want to watch it as a movie.
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
want to carry around the boxes to get to each cutscene. So I wasn't a Death Stranding fan, but you know, I like the atmosphere and the ambience of Death Stranding, I suppose.
and Nate,
I'll tell you, this is an unpopular opinion, but I can't stand the cutscenes. I also don't have time, so I like the sandbox games, and
Yep.
and I think I'm definitely the type that likes to just walk around and drive and maybe cause mayhem. I like racing games a lot, and let's see what else. Sports, just because I like things where it's 2-player with my kids.
Minecraft?
And my chance to beat them.
So what sport games do you like? I'm a big sports game fan.
Equestria 2001, where you ride a horse.
We'll play FIFA, or
Oh, yeah.
they re-put out NHL 94, and so that was my favorite game.
NHL 94
growing up.
classic.
Sega Genesis.
Racing, I like Burnout Paradise because there's no story. You just drive and like find races or kind of do stunts. But the thing that really tears my family apart is we play Overcooked.
oh my god,
I love Overcooked.
I hate
It's a
that
great
game.
underrated
I hate
game.
That game.
No,
I
it's so good.
I worked as a busboy and in a kitchen for a long time in my teens, and so to me it's like a hilarious game. It's like the 4 of us in there, and then it always ends somehow in like shouting or the verge of tears. Like
It's like the new age Monopoly. I feel like Monopoly. used to
No,
do that to
it's
families.
honestly, it's a little bit of
it's
like
4 of us at once, and I love that.
it's a little bit of like tourism, like privileged tourism. Like, let's go work at a restaurant.
I got a question.
It's kind of bad, but it's great. It's so much
Well,
fun.
for both of you, do you guys ever find yourselves fighting? This goes back to school. Do you guys ever fight people that try to push Minecraft a lot? Like, I don't know if like that's a thing, but like I noticed that my students fucking love Minecraft.
My
including-
kids like it. My kids like it.
Yeah, like I'm always like I'm not a big fan, although I have a Minecraft YouTube channel.
I was gonna say,
but okay, it doesn't matter.
Plug it.
And no, we're not plugging it in. We're not plugging it. We're not doing it this time.
Wallymoto,
But how
watch
do
it.
you combat the Minecraft vibes? Because I don't know. I feel like that's like such a pop cultural game. I don't know if you guys play it. But like, what's your thoughts? Like, Liam, I'm really curious about your thoughts of Minecraft.
I'm not I mean, again, I'm aware I'm talking to a Minecraft YouTuber, but I'm not
I hate the game. Honestly, I still
I'm
do
not-
it because I have to fight myself of just saying like I gotta enjoy this game somehow.
You're like a masochist or something.
Yeah, I guess.
Like
He
you
really
hate
is.
it so much you had to make a YouTube channel. But
And that's weird.
He's just a contrarian. That's all
Yeah.
it is. Yeah.
right.
okay.
Yeah, I'm not a like. Again, it like.
But do you see your students loving it, or no?
I mean they're like they're into the yeah, they're not into the more kids orientated games.
Cool.
And they're not making those either. Like they're making games that they can add value to as trained architects, I suppose, which are much more complex environmentally and so on. So Minecraft kind of passed me by.
Yeah, I just wonder, like, in a few generations, because it's so
If they'll catch up to you.
impactful now. I don't. I mean, I would assume
Well, I
you're.
think it was bigger. I remember seeing a lot of architecture projects. Actually, the show here, you guys should look up the Figure Ground game.
Oh, I saw it.
Right.
No, amazing.
Was
You
like
showed it in the lecture too, Nate. Yeah.
Somewhat early on in that world, or not in that world, in that time. And I think there was a bunch of that kind of low-res
Yeah.
work going on kind of all over at schools, and definitely had a relationship to that. But I don't see as much of it at the moment, not because, I mean, I see these young kids are still clearly playing it, but yeah, I'm curious if it comes in waves.
And I think we've seen it a lot in
That's why I bring it up, yeah.
portfolio applications to our bachelor's program, and then we're like, how do we evaluate this? Because it's cool, but what is it?
Oh, you're saying like a high schooler, because that's like
Yeah.
what
We get that a
Well,
lot.
I taught comprehensive studio, and I had a student that wanted to like revolve his comprehensive behind Minecraft, which I was all for it, but it's just like I see it a lot. You know?
Yeah. Well, we are running up on time, guys. First of all, we should just thank you guys. This has been really fun, and I hope we hear from you guys again. Maybe there's some other MXT collaborations in the future with either one of you guys. But
thank you so
honestly,
much.
thank you for doing this. I think our students, and hopefully, our wider pool of listeners and other people that kind of look at our content, I hope they know a little bit more about what SCI-Arc does and what you've been doing in your program, and also maybe just how important actually SCI-Arc has been in the discipline over the last I guess a long time. So Anyway,
Over
thank you
50
guys.
years.
Over
Over
50
50
years. Yeah, thank you for doing this.
It's crazy.
Thank you for the invite, you guys.
Yeah, great
thanks for having me do
conversation.
it.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys.